When we think of the Vikings, the mind often leaps first to images of longships slicing through cold seas, of warriors with axes raised, of raids and plunder. But this picture, while not wrong, leaves out something essential. Beneath the steel, the sails, and the fury of their journeys lay a deeper current that shaped how they lived, fought, and dreamed. That current was magic and myth, not as an abstract idea or something reserved for holy days, but as the very breath that moved through their world. The Vikings did not draw hard lines between what was real and what was mythic. For them, the visible and invisible overlapped constantly, like two sides of a woven cloth. A man could plant his field while remembering the story of how Freyr brought fertility to the earth, and he could step onto his ship believing that Njord or Thor might guide the winds if he spoke the right words or carved the right signs. To step into their world is to enter a place where gods and spirits walked close, where every storm and every shadow carried meaning. They saw themselves as living in the middle of something vast and alive, what they called Midgard, a realm connected by roots and branches to other worlds beyond sight. Over their heads loomed the ash tree Yggdrasil, stretching into heavens and underworlds, binding all existence together. When they looked at the stars, they did not see only distant lights, but pathways trodden by gods and heroes. When they told stories of Odin wandering in disguise, of Thor hammering giants, or of Loki's tricks, they were not merely entertaining themselves but teaching, warning, and preserving the map of the universe. Myth for them was not a tale outside reality. It was reality's hidden layer, something that shaped each harvest, voyage, and battle. Everyday life in Scandinavia was hard. The soil was thin, winters were long, seas were cruel, and survival depended on courage, skill, and luck. Yet luck was not random in their eyes. It was tied to fate, to unseen forces that could be swayed with charms, runes, or sacrifice. When a farmer lost his cattle in a storm, he might blame an angry spirit. When a ship survived a sudden squall, sailors might give thanks to Thor's strength. When a warrior returned alive from battle, he believed not only in his own bravery, but in the favor of the gods. These beliefs were not mere decoration on top of practical life. They were the way life itself was understood. Without them, the world would seem empty and senseless. With them, every moment carried purpose, and every hardship could be endured because it was part of a greater pattern. Children grew up with this world of stories from the time they could speak. Around the fire in smoky longhouses, elders would tell how the gods created the world from the body of a slain giant, or how the first humans were carved from driftwood. These were not bedtime fancies but sacred truths, teaching the youngest that they belonged to a universe full of wonder and danger. To know the myths was to know how to live. They told why thunder rolled, why winter returned each year, why death was not the end but a passage to another hall or shadowy realm. In hearing them, a child learned that he or she was part of a story larger than their own lifetime. The warriors who rowed longships across seas did not fight with steel alone. They carried with them invisible allies. Some carved runes into the wood of their weapons or whispered invocations before battle. Others wore amulets shaped like Thor's hammer to call down his protection. Even those who doubted such things could not escape the power of collective belief, for to fight among men who felt the gods stood beside them was to feel braver than you might otherwise dare. And when armies clashed, it was not just flesh and iron that decided victory, but the will of unseen powers, the turning of fate, the strength of spells uttered in the dark. It is tempting today to separate the Viking as farmer, trader, or raider from the Viking as believer in myth and magic. Yet to them no such division existed. The soil needed blessings as much as tilling. The ship needed runes as much as sails. The warrior needed courage as much as charms. Myth was the thread that bound together their whole way of life. To forget that is to miss the heart of who they were. Their sagas tell of raids and kings, but always alongside them appear omens, visions, curses, and gifts of gods. To be Viking was to live with one foot in Midgard, and the other always brushing the unseen. This blend of the ordinary and the magical made their world vivid and charged. They lived with danger on all sides, but also with a sense that their lives mattered in a cosmic struggle. Every man and woman played a role, whether small or great, in the weaving of fate. To act bravely, to honor the gods, to remember the old ways, to carve the right signs, these acts gave shape and meaning to existence. Without them, life would be nothing but cold seas and hard winters. With them, even death could be faced with courage, for it was but a doorway to another hall, perhaps even Odin's own. To understand the Vikings, then, we must begin not with the clang of their swords or the reach of their voyages, but with the breath of the gods that moved through their every day. This breath whispered in the creak of trees, the crash of waves, the flicker of fire, the clash of steel. It told them who they were and what they must do. It gave them hope in hardship, courage in battle, and purpose in the endless rhythm of life and death. The Vikings were not merely raiders of the seas. They were children of a living cosmos, and magic and myth were the air they breathed. Among all the gifts that myth and magic placed in Viking hands, none carried more weight than the runes. To the modern eye, they may appear as simple angular symbols scratched into stone or wood, but to the people of the north they were far more than an alphabet. They were the shapes of power, carved lines that could bind fate, summon strength, and carry meaning across the visible and invisible worlds. To write a rune was not only to leave a message, but to touch the fabric of reality itself. Every line cut into a stone or bone was a small act of creation, a reflection of the god who first gave them to mankind. The story of their origin begins with Odin, the wanderer and seeker of wisdom. He hung himself on the great ash tree Yggdrasil, pierced by his own spear, neither eating nor drinking for 9 long nights. In that agony, he glimpsed the runes deep below, waiting in the roots of existence. By sacrifice and suffering, he seized them, pulling forth their secret knowledge. When he finally fell from the tree, he brought the runes back as a gift to gods and men, a treasure won not by strength of arms, but by endurance of spirit. That myth told every Viking that the runes were not inventions of men, but holy shapes wrested from the bones of the cosmos. To carve them was to echo Odin's great trial, to share in a spark of his wisdom and power. Runes were everywhere in Viking life. On great stones raised in memory of the dead, they declared names, deeds, and lineages, ensuring that no life vanished without record. On weapons, they were etched for victory and courage. On cups and amulets, they promised health, luck, and protection. A trader might carve them on his goods to guard against theft. A sailor might mark his ship with them to withstand storms. They were language, prayer, and spell at once. Even when used for simple inscriptions, their shapes were believed to hum with more than mere sound. Each rune carried its own character, linked to natural forces and hidden powers, and so writing them was always a delicate act, never done carelessly. The people who mastered them held both respect and fear. Not everyone could carve runes with true skill. To arrange them wrongly could twist their meaning or even backfire, turning a blessing into a curse. Wisdom songs and sagas tell of runes used to heal wounds, to protect women in childbirth, to ward off sickness, but also of runes that brought madness, bound men in helpless sleep, or cursed enemies with endless misfortune. It was said that only those who studied long and carefully, often under the guidance of seers or priests, could unlock their deeper layers. For most, the simple act of carving a known sign for protection was enough, but for the learned, the runes were a vast and dangerous sea of power. One story tells of a young warrior who attempted to carve runes to win the love of a woman. His lack of knowledge twisted the charm, and the girl fell gravely ill. Only a wiser man could scrape away the false lines and carve the true signs of healing, saving her life. This tale, passed from mouth to mouth, warned that the runes were not toys. They demanded respect, for they were older than men, as old as creation itself. To treat them lightly was to invite disaster. Such stories reminded the Vikings that knowledge carried responsibility, and that even the smallest carved symbol could ripple through unseen realms. The beauty of the runes was also in their mystery. Unlike the later alphabets brought by Christianity, the runes were never meant to serve only for writing long texts. They were sparse, symbolic, a language designed for stone and wood, brief and sharp as a cry. A runestone standing in a meadow did more than speak. It radiated. It stood as both marker and talisman, declaring memory while anchoring magical protection to the land. The stones that remain today, weathered and silent, still carry that aura, as if the power placed within them never wholly faded. Runes could be drawn, carved, painted, or even whispered. To trace them in air with a hand was to summon their force invisibly. To chant their names aloud was to weave their magic into sound. A rune was not only a mark but an idea, a breath of order against the chaos of the unknown. Farmers traced them over fields, mothers over children, smiths over their forges. Each act was a way of tying the fragile human world to the strength of the divine. It is telling that Odin himself was known as the god of wisdom and war, poetry and sorcery, and the runes were his greatest gift. Through them, language and magic became one. In their strokes lay the idea that words are never powerless, that speech itself is a force, that names and stories shape reality. The Vikings, who told tales to preserve memory and sang poems to honor the dead, believed that words carved in the form of runes could last beyond the voice, binding the unseen into the seen. When a Viking touched the grooves of a rune, he touched more than a letter. He touched the echo of sacrifice, the memory of gods, the song of fate. This sense of living magic was what gave their world color and weight. They did not write to decorate or to amuse. They wrote to bind, to protect, to remember, to curse. To the Viking mind, a word carved in runes was a word that could never be lost, even if the body that spoke it turned to dust. It was a word with teeth, a word alive. So the runes became both mirror and weapon, carrying across the centuries the strange pulse of a people who believed that lines cut into wood could hold the same strength as steel. They gave shape to memory, shielded lives, and tied men to their gods. In them, the Vikings found a way to make thought and magic one, and in them we see not only an alphabet, but the very soul of a culture that carved its presence into history as boldly as it carved its marks into stone. Among the many threads that wove together Viking belief, none shimmered more strangely than the art of seer. This was not the common use of charms or the casual carving of runes that many practiced, but something deeper, darker, and more demanding. Seer was the magic of weaving fate, of slipping across the border between what is and what may yet come. It was a craft feared as much as it was respected, for it touched forces beyond ordinary human reach. Those who walked this path were seen as both gifted and dangerous, their powers admired and distrusted in equal measure. Seer belonged first to the gods, and even in their stories it carried an air of danger. Odin himself learned it, though it was said to be the domain of the goddess Freyr. He traveled far to gain its secrets, for he was never content with the knowledge he already had. To practice seer was to see beyond the present moment, to bend the hidden currents of chance and choice. It could bring visions of what lay ahead, guide the hand of fate, or unravel the strength of an enemy. Yet it was not a skill free of cost. To peer too long into those depths risked losing one's place among ordinary men. To wield such knowledge was to set oneself apart, marked as someone who lived with one foot in another realm. Those who practiced seer were known as seers or shamans, though their roles were fluid. Some were women who traveled from farm to farm, invited into homes to read the threads of the future. They dressed in cloaks of many colors, carrying staffs carved with symbols, their presence both commanding and unsettling. Families would welcome them with offerings, asking for blessings over crops, protection for journeys, or insight into choices that could not be decided by reason alone. When they spoke, their words were heavy with the authority of the unseen, and though not all listened gladly, none dared dismiss them. Men too could learn seer, though this was seen as unusual and often unsettling. The sagas tell us that a man who practiced this magic risked being shamed, for it was considered unmanly by the standards of the warrior society. Yet Odin himself, the greatest of gods, embraced it despite the mockery, showing that the hunger for wisdom outweighed any scorn. This tension revealed the strange duality of seer. It was both feared and essential, condemned and yet sought after. Its power was undeniable, and when war or survival was at stake, no one cared whether its use aligned with custom. In practice, seer often took the form of trance and song. The seer would sit or stand, staff in hand, while others gathered around to chant. Their voices wove a rhythm that carried the shaman's spirit beyond the walls of the hall, beyond the reach of the firelight, into the shadowed spaces where fate itself could be glimpsed. Through this journey, visions came, storms gathering on the sea, betrayal hidden in a friend's smile, a child yet to be born, or an enemy's sudden downfall. What was seen might not always be clear, for fate was a tangle of threads, but the gift of seer was to see enough to guide others through uncertainty. At times, seer was not only about seeing but about shaping. A skilled practitioner could send harm against an enemy, binding their strength, sapping their courage, or bringing confusion to their minds. Warriors feared such curses as much as swords, for who could fight when fear clouded the heart or when exhaustion gripped the limbs without cause? Entire battles could sway if one side believed their foes carried such magic. The Vikings lived in a world where unseen powers were always present, and belief itself could make those powers real. To know that a seer had turned her will against you was to feel the chill of destiny closing in. But seer was not only a tool of destruction. It also brought healing, protection, and guidance. Some seers were called upon to bless the harvest, to aid in childbirth, or to guard against wandering spirits that might trouble the living. For many households, the visit of a seer was both a moment of fear and of hope. She was a link to forces greater than themselves, a living bridge between the human world and the deeper mysteries. People gave her gifts of food, cloth, or silver, not only as payment but as acknowledgement that her work carried weight far beyond simple services. The sagas record moments when the future was laid bare by such practices. In one tale, a seeress foretold the doom of a great family, her words ringing with sorrow even as the warriors around her refused to believe. Later, when her visions came true, the story was remembered as proof of the power of seer. Again and again, we find in these old tales the same truth, that to ignore the voice of the seer was to court disaster. Yet, for all its might, seer was never seen as entirely safe. It was always a step too close to the edge, a crossing into realms where ordinary men and women were not meant to tread. Even those who sought the help of seers sometimes feared them, whispering when they left, wondering if their power might turn back upon them. This mix of reverence and suspicion was part of what gave seer its enduring place in the Viking world. It was not everyday magic, but a profound, unsettling force that shaped lives and choices in ways both seen and unseen. In the end, seer was less about controlling fate and more about understanding its currents. Those who practiced it accepted that the future could not be entirely changed, but believed that glimpses of it could give strength, wisdom, or advantage. It was a way of standing closer to the gods, of touching the raw edges of destiny. To the Vikings, who lived in a world where every voyage risked storms and every battle risked death, such knowledge was priceless, even if it came wrapped in fear. Thus, the practice of seer endured, woven into the sagas and whispered through the generations. It reminded the Norse people that life was more than what lay before the eyes, that hidden forces shaped every moment, and that the greatest power sometimes belonged not to the strongest arm, but to the one who dared to look into the shadows and return with truth. To understand the Vikings, one must see how close the gods were to their daily existence. These were not distant deities sitting in unreachable heavens, far removed from the world of men. They were companions, protectors, rivals, and even neighbors in a way. Their presence was woven into the rhythm of life, from the planting of seeds to the raising of sails, from the lighting of a hearth to the drawing of a sword. A Viking did not separate faith from action, nor belief from work. The gods were everywhere, guiding hands and warning voices, and ignoring them was unthinkable. Odin, the All-Father, was not just a figure of high myth. To the wandering poet, he was the giver of inspiration, whispering new words in dreams and songs. To the warrior, he was the chooser of the slain, watching from above to see who would fall and who would live another day. In the stillness before battle, a man might pray quietly for Odin's favor, asking not for safety but for honor, knowing that to die well under his gaze was better than to grow old forgotten. To live with Odin in mind was to accept that life's meaning came not only from survival, but from deeds worthy of remembrance. Thor, the Thunderer, was even closer to the common folk. His hammer was a shield over farmers, sailors, and craftsmen alike. When storms rolled across the sky, the Vikings heard Thor's hammer crashing against the giants, protecting the world from chaos. The sound of thunder was not only frightening but reassuring, for it meant the protector was still fighting for them. Farmers carved his sign into tools, sailors painted his hammer on ships, and brides wore amulets in his name. He was the strength that guarded ordinary lives, a god not of distant wisdom but of steady, unshakable presence. Freyr's influence touched the heart of love, longing, and beauty, but also the grim edge of battle. She was the goddess of desire and fertility, yet she claimed half of the fallen warriors for her own hall, leaving the rest to Odin. For women, she was a figure of power and freedom, a reminder that strength was not only found in men. For men, she was both adored and feared, for her magic was deep and her choices beyond their control. To call on Freyr was to invite passion and fortune, but also the weight of her mysteries. The god Njord, with his blessings of wealth and the sea, was vital for a people whose lives were bound to ships and trade. A sailor would whisper his name when winds rose against the mast, asking for calm seas and safe harbors. Traders invoked him before journeys, hoping his favor would bring silver and safe return. His children, Freyr and Freyr, embodied fertility, abundance, and vitality, and in their honor men and women sought prosperity, marriage, and good harvests. To live without their favor was to risk hunger and misfortune. Even the trickster Loki played a role in daily thought. He was the unpredictable spark that reminded people that not everything could be planned or trusted. His tales were warnings of how easily pride and greed could bring ruin, yet also how cleverness could sometimes turn disaster into survival. He was both admired and despised, a reminder that life held chaos as well as order, and that every feast and every voyage carried risk. The Vikings understood well that fortune could change without warning, and in Loki's shadow they saw that truth reflected. Everyday rituals made these gods part of the home. Before eating, a family might set aside a bit of food for the spirits or speak a prayer of thanks. When a child was born, amulets were placed near the cradle to call on divine protection. When a ship was built, sacrifices were made at the keel, a way of tying its fate to the goodwill of the gods. Even small acts like carving a rune, tying a knot, or pouring the first drink of ale on the ground were signs that life was lived in the company of powers greater than oneself. The gods were also present in oaths and promises. To swear upon a god's name was not taken lightly, for breaking such an oath invited ruin. A warrior might promise loyalty in Odin's name, a farmer might vow to share his harvest in Freyr's honor, and a chieftain might seal alliances by calling on Thor to strike him down if he betrayed trust. These oaths were not symbolic. They bound people with invisible cords that could not be broken without consequence. To believe the gods listened was to believe that every word mattered, every promise carried weight beyond the moment. Festivals and sacrifices further bound the people to their gods. At times of harvest, slaughter, or need, men and women gathered to give offerings, animals, goods, or even captured enemies in darker times. They believed such gifts renewed the bond between mortals and divine, ensuring health, victory, and protection. The feasts that followed were not only moments of joy but also of gratitude, for eating and drinking in honor of the gods was itself a sacred act. These moments reminded the community that survival was never the work of men alone, but of men in partnership with powers greater than themselves. Even death was bound to the gods. A Viking burial was not only about saying farewell, but about sending the dead into the care of divine hands. Whether buried in mounds, burned in ships, or sent into the sea, the dead were believed to journey toward halls of gods, spirits, and ancestors. To live bravely and die well was to join the company of heroes, shielded and celebrated in worlds beyond sight. The knowledge that Odin, Freyr, or Hel awaited shaped the way Vikings lived, for they carried in their hearts the constant reminder that every day was lived before the watchful eyes of powers they could not ignore. The gods in Viking life were not myths to be told only in stories by the fire. They were forces that shaped every breath, every harvest, every storm, and every battle. They were the invisible companions of daily labor and the final judges of a life's worth. To the Norse, life was not lived alone, nor was it lived in silence. It was lived in conversation with gods, in offerings and prayers, in fear and in hope, with a belief that unseen hands guided every step. To the Vikings, battle was never only the clash of iron and the roar of men. It was a sacred act, bound by rituals that reached far deeper than blood and steel. When warriors marched to war, they did not see themselves as stepping into chaos alone. They entered a space where gods, spirits, and fate mingled with human courage. Before the first sword was lifted, men prepared not just their weapons but their souls, for they believed that the difference between victory and ruin often rested on the unseen forces they could summon to their side. In the long nights before a raid, men gathered in halls to drink and sing, but beneath the laughter and boasting lay something more solemn. Songs were offerings in themselves, chants that called on Odin for wisdom, Thor for strength, and Tyr for courage. Women prepared charms and whispered prayers into amulets that their husbands or sons would carry into battle. Some warriors carved runes into the hilts of swords or the edges of shields, not as decoration but as spells meant to bite deeper, to deflect arrows, or to strike terror into the hearts of enemies. Each mark carried belief, and belief itself was seen as power. Sacrifice played its part too. Before the ships left shore, animals were sometimes slaughtered, their blood offered to the gods of war and sea. The cries of the beasts and the sight of their lifeblood falling to the earth tied the warriors to the divine. The gods were not asked politely. They were fed, honored, and bound by gift. In return, the men believed they gained favor, a shield of spirit over their fleet, and courage unbroken in the coming storm of blades. Even the smallest gesture, pouring the first cup of ale into the waves, was an offering to ensure that winds and waves carried them safely to their enemy's shore. As dawn broke on the day of battle, rituals continued. Warriors painted their faces, not only to frighten but to transform themselves into more than men. Some donned animal skins, wolf or bear, believing they could channel the spirits of those beasts. To fight as a berserker was to give oneself over to a fury beyond reason, a sacred madness where pain was forgotten and fear erased. Others carried charms from seers, pieces of bone or cloth inscribed with words of power. Every detail, from the way helmets were tied to the songs shouted as they marched, was wrapped in meaning. Nothing was left to chance, because chance itself was seen as a realm of spirits that could be bent by will. Once battle began, the rituals did not vanish. They were carried into the fight itself. The first cry that split the air was not just a shout, but an invocation, a war scream meant to awaken courage and strike dread. Shields banged together, swords clashed against wood, and the earth shook with the rhythm of fury. Many believed that Odin himself hovered above the field, sending his Valkyries to choose the slain. To fall under his gaze was to be marked for Valhalla, and so men rushed forward not with fear of death, but with eagerness to meet it well. The ritual of battle was to live as though every moment was being weighed by divine hands. When victory came, it too was marked by sacred acts. The spoils of war were not simply divided as prizes of greed, but often set aside in part as offerings. A portion of silver might be buried, weapons might be broken and given to the earth or sea, and prisoners might be sacrificed to gods who had guided the warrior's hands. Victory was a gift from the divine, and to hoard it without tribute was to invite future ruin. Feasts held afterward were not only celebrations, but also acts of worship, with meat and ale shared as tokens of gratitude. Men toasted the gods, toasted their ancestors, and toasted the dead who had fallen bravely. Each cup was lifted as both remembrance and prayer. For those who had died, their treatment was also wrapped in ritual. A fallen warrior was not left forgotten on the ground. He was honored, his body raised upon ships or laid in mounds, his weapons placed beside him for the next world. Fires blazed across the night sky, carrying his spirit into the realm of gods. To die in battle was not a tragedy in their eyes, but a passage, and the rituals around it ensured that the soul traveled with dignity, claimed not by despair but by glory. Those left behind could find peace knowing that their brother or son walked now in the halls of heroes. Even defeat carried ritual weight. When battles were lost, survivors sought omens and sacrifices to explain what had gone wrong. Were the gods displeased? Was an oath broken? Had Loki's trickery played its hand? Defeat was not only a failure of strength but of spirit, and to restore balance, the warriors and their kin turned to offerings and vows. The gods had to be won back, their favor rekindled, their wrath calmed. Through ritual, even shame could be shaped into resolve for the battles yet to come. These practices may seem strange to the modern eye, yet to the Viking they gave shape to the chaos of war. Every battle was a storm of steel, but behind that storm was the belief that human effort alone could not decide the outcome. Ritual was the bridge between mortal will and divine fate. It gave men courage when fear threatened to break them, and it gave meaning to death when it came suddenly on the field. To fight with ritual was to fight with the gods at your side, and to win was to prove that the bond had held true. Rituals of battle and victory show us how deeply the Vikings lived in a world where the unseen was as real as the visible. For them, war was never only about power, land, or treasure. It was a spiritual act, bound to their gods and their myths, a performance of courage before the eyes of the divine. To understand this is to see why they fought with such fearlessness, and why even in defeat they carried themselves with pride. Every axe swing, every shield wall, every shout of rage was part of a greater rhythm, a song written not only by men but by gods who shared their fate. Among the Vikings there lived a group of people who were not warriors, not kings, not farmers, and not poets, yet they held a kind of power that even the strongest feared. These were the seers and prophets, the ones who looked beyond the veil of the everyday world into the deep and dangerous streams of fate. While the warrior sharpened his sword and the farmer turned his soil, The seer stirred the unseen forces that governed both life and death. Their place was unlike any other, for they did not wield authority by crown or blade, but by whispers and visions, by the trust of those who longed to know what tomorrow would bring. The seer, often a woman, stood outside the ordinary life of her people. She wandered from village to village, called upon when omens darkened the skies, or when chieftains faced choices that could shape the lives of thousands. She was sometimes feared as much as revered, for she claimed to see what others could not, and those who peer too far into the threads of destiny rarely walk untouched. To host such a woman was considered an honor, but also a risk. Her presence demanded respect, her food and drink prepared with care, her seat at feasts given a place of dignity. Those who failed to honor her properly risked not only her anger, but the anger of the gods she was thought to serve. The rituals of prophecy were as varied as the lands the Vikings sailed. Some seers carried staffs carved with runes. They were etched with signs of power that turned their touch into something more than human. Others wore cloaks of fur and beads of amber, their attire marking them as living vessels of the sacred. They sat by fires or in high seats while drums pounded and voices chanted. With each rhythm, the seer's mind slipped from the hall into a place beyond, where voices of gods and spirits spoke in riddles. Those watching believed that in such moments, the veil between worlds thinned, and that the seer walked paths that mortals dared not tread. In these states they spoke of what was to come. They told kings whether to march to war or stay their hand, whether to marry into one family or another, whether to sail west into unknown waters or remain close to familiar shores. The words of a seer could shape a kingdom's fate. Yet they never spoke plainly, for the language of prophecy was never simple. The gods whispered in images, in twisted symbols and half-truths. A seer might say that a warrior would win great fame, yet leave unspoken that fame could come through a glorious death. Her words might promise victory, but in ways that demanded careful listening, for the divine tongue rarely gave mortals exactly what they wished. The influence of prophets stretched beyond war. Farmers asked about harvests, sailors about storms, women about childbirth, merchants about trade. Each answer guided choices, each vision a lantern flickering in the fog of uncertainty. Yet with such power came suspicion. Some saw seers as tools of Loki, masters of deceit. Some feared that they cursed as easily as they blessed, that a single whispered word could sour milk, twist an ankle, or bring sudden death. It was said that when a seer looked at you too long, she might unravel secrets you kept hidden even from yourself. To live in a world where fate was both knowable and unavoidable was to walk always in awe of those who claimed to glimpse its patterns. Men also practiced prophecy, though less often. Some were known as rune masters, reading carved symbols on wood or stone to reveal hidden truths. Others looked at the flight of birds, the shapes in fire, or the curling patterns of smoke. Yet the image of the wandering female seer remained the strongest in Viking memory, perhaps because she embodied something the people both needed and feared. She carried with her the echo of the Norns, the three great weavers of destiny who spun the threads of all lives. By calling upon a seer, one was not simply asking for advice, but touching, however briefly, the edges of a cosmic tapestry too vast to fully understand. When such figures appeared in sagas, they were given gravitas. They arrived cloaked and silent, with eyes that pierced through the noise of the hall. Men who had drunk all night grew quiet when they entered. Even jarls leaned forward, eager to hear the words that could turn triumph into disaster or disaster into unexpected fortune. And though many claimed to trust their swords more than visions, few would risk ignoring the voice of one who saw through the shadows. The sagas remind us again and again that those who mocked the seers or refused to heed them often met cruel ends. The seers did not act as masters of fate, but as its interpreters. They reminded people that life was never only the realm of human will. The gods had their games, the spirits their whispers, and the Norns their weaving. To listen to prophecy was to accept that your path might already be written, yet to ignore it was to walk blind into traps of your own making. The Viking world was shaped by courage and steel, but it was also bound by the invisible threads these prophets spoke of. Their words gave structure to the chaos, meaning to suffering, and hope to despair. Even when their visions brought dread, people sought them out. To know that doom awaited was still better than walking unaware into it. In a world where death could come by storm, blade, or sickness at any moment, prophecy gave the comfort of preparation. If the gods demanded a life, then at least one could face it with honor. If fortune was promised, then it could be pursued with conviction. This was the gift of the seer, not to change destiny but to teach men and women how to live with it. In the end, seers and prophets stood at the heart of Viking belief as living reminders that the world was more than fields and fjords. They brought the vast, wild, dangerous expanse of the unseen into the firelit halls of their people. They gave voice to what lay beyond the horizon, shaping choices with words that carried both mystery and weight. To understand them is to see how the Vikings themselves understood life, not as a straight path forged only by strength, but as a woven fabric where gods, humans, and fate were forever entangled. The Vikings lived in a world where words were never seen as empty sounds. To speak was to shape reality, to name something was to bring it into being, and to carve a mark upon stone or wood was to leave a trace of that power for as long as it lasted. Among all the symbols they used, none held greater meaning than the runes. These were not mere letters, not only tools for writing down names and deeds, but vessels of mystery, believed to carry within them the raw force of creation. To understand runes was not simply to write, but to touch the very bones of the cosmos. Runes came from the myths themselves. In the stories told by firelight, it was Odin, the All-Father, who first brought them into the world. He had hung upon Yggdrasil, the world tree, pierced by his own spear, starving and sleepless, enduring agony for 9 nights in a sacrifice not to another god but to himself. When at last the secret of the runes revealed itself, he seized them, wrenching from the deep well of existence the knowledge of signs that bound together life, death, and fate. To the Vikings, this tale showed that runes were not human invention but divine discovery, given through suffering and vision, and therefore sacred beyond measure. Every rune carried both a sound and a meaning. They could form words, but each on its own was also a symbol of power. A single rune carved into a sword might grant victory, another marked on a drinking horn might protect from poison, while one cut into a ship's mast might call upon winds or guard against storms. These uses were not thought of as superstition, but as practical acts, binding human intention to the living currents of the universe. Runes were at once language and spell, inscription and invocation. Because of this, not everyone was trusted to wield them. To carve a rune without understanding its deeper essence was dangerous. A poorly drawn sign could twist fortune into disaster, bringing harm instead of help. The sagas tell of men who tried to use runes to heal but only made wounds worse, or of those who carved love runes that brought madness rather than affection. The true masters of the craft were seen as half magicians, part scholars, part shamans. Their knowledge gave them influence, and though some feared them, many sought their help in times of crisis. Runes were inscribed on grave markers, on amulets, on weapons, on tools, on household objects, and even on the very walls of homes. Sometimes they carried simple messages, like names or ownership, but often they carried prayers, charms, or warnings. To walk through Viking lands was to encounter these signs carved into wood or etched into stone, reminders that every surface could become a channel for the unseen. Even long after the hands that carved them were gone, the runes remained, holding power across generations. The meanings of the runes themselves were layered, drawn from nature, myth, and human experience. One rune symbolized wealth, not only in silver or gold, but in the prosperity of cattle and fertile fields. Another stood for ice, a force that could preserve or destroy. Another spoke of journeys, of paths taken across land or sea. Yet another captured the idea of joy, not as fleeting pleasure, but as a state of harmony with fate. To read the runes was to see the world through a lens where every element carried meaning, and every moment was tied to larger cycles. In battle, warriors sometimes trusted runes more than steel. Carved into blades, they were believed to bite deeper, to carry with them not only the edge of iron but the edge of destiny itself. Some carved runes into shields for protection, believing that the wood itself could be hardened against blows by the marks of power. In the sagas, we find tales of warriors who survived impossible odds, and while courage and strength are always praised, the presence of runes in their weapons is often hinted as the hidden reason. But runes were not limited to war. In love, they were carved on tokens exchanged between men and women, meant to bind hearts together. In healing, they were scratched on bark or bone, then pressed against wounds or soaked into water that was drunk like medicine. In justice, they might be used to swear oaths, each line etched into wood as a reminder that the gods themselves stood witness. In seafaring, they were drawn onto the prows of ships, calling for safe passage. No part of life was untouched by their reach, for the Vikings believed that the runes could shape every aspect of existence. Though some outsiders might have seen them as primitive letters, to the Vikings they were keys. They unlocked not only communication but transformation, opening doors between what was visible and what was hidden. Even centuries later, as Christianity spread through the north, runes endured. Many carved crosses alongside them, blending old magic with new faith. Some priests condemned their use, fearing them as pagan sorcery, while others tolerated them, unable to erase the deep roots they held in the culture. Runes gave the Vikings a sense of control in a world often ruled by chaos. The sea could turn violent without warning, enemies could strike from beyond the horizon, sickness could steal life in a single night. In such a world, the act of carving a rune was more than ritual. It was defiance. It was a statement that humans were not helpless, that they too could grasp a fragment of the powers that governed all things. Each carved line was a reminder that even in uncertainty, there was order waiting to be found, if only one had the courage to reach for it. To us today, runes may seem like relics of the past, mysterious symbols carved into stones in windswept fields. But to the Vikings, they were alive, pulsing with energy, a direct connection to gods and fate. To hold them, to trace their lines with a finger, was to touch the same knowledge Odin had bled for, the same wisdom whispered by the roots of the world tree. That sense of awe, that belief in words as living things, shaped their entire culture. For in the end, runes were not only signs, they were the very voice of destiny, etched into the world itself. The world of the Vikings was never separated into sacred and ordinary, the way later ages tried to divide them. For them, every moment of life carried the presence of the unseen. The same powers that shaped storms and guided fates were believed to linger in the smallest details of the day. To live without some form of protection was unthinkable, and so charms and amulets became as common as clothing, worn close to the body, carried in pouches, or tied to ships and homes. These were not luxuries for the few but necessities for many, a way of weaving invisible strength into the fabric of daily living. Among the most familiar objects was the hammer of Thor, Mjolnir, worn as a pendant. Small hammers made of silver, bronze, or iron have been found across Viking lands, showing how deeply people trusted in Thor's power to shield them. To wear his hammer was to call upon the thunder god, not only in times of war but in times of uncertainty. Farmers wore it as they tended their fields, hoping it would bring rain or guard against lightning. Sailors wore it as they set out on the open sea, trusting that the roar of Thor's storms would not strike their own vessels. Women wore it in their households, seeing in Thor not only the warrior but also the protector of hearth and kin. The hammer was a symbol of strength, but also of balance, for Thor was both destroyer of giants and guardian of order. Other amulets carried images of animals, each chosen for its connection to the divine or for the qualities it represented. Bears, wolves, ravens, serpents, and horses all appeared in the charms people carried. A bear claw might be strung on a cord as a token of raw strength. A wolf tooth might guard its wearer with cunning and ferocity. Ravens were linked to Odin, his eyes and ears in the world, so their feathers or carved likenesses were believed to draw wisdom and insight. Horses, sacred in many rituals, were symbols of vitality and movement, ensuring safe journeys or fertility of land and family. To the Vikings, each creature carried a part of the great web of power, and to keep a piece of it was to borrow some of that force. Charms were not always carved from metal or stone. They could be simple things, gathered from nature, believed to hold within them hidden gifts. A piece of driftwood found on the shore might be seen as blessed by the sea. A smooth stone pulled from a river might be carried for luck. Herbs were dried and kept in small bags, not only for their healing scent but for their spiritual strength. Even knots tied into string or hair could be charms, binding intention into a tangible form. The simplest objects could carry the greatest weight, because what mattered was not their shape but the belief woven into them. In battle, warriors often relied on charms as much as weapons. Some tied small amulets into their hair or beards. Others tucked them beneath their armor, so close to the heart that they might shield against both fear and blade. Before setting out to fight, warriors might rub a talisman, whispering words that fused courage into its surface. If they returned victorious, that same charm would be treasured as proof of its power, passed down as inheritance or buried in a grave to guide them into the next world. Yet charms were not only for moments of danger. They were part of daily rhythm, part of the way the Vikings carried themselves through life. Mothers placed small tokens in the cradles of their children, asking the guards to watch over their fragile sleep. Farmers buried charms in their fields before planting, believing that hidden beneath the soil they would call for healthy growth. Traders carried them on journeys to foreign lands, hoping for fair bargains and safe roads. To step outside without some form of protection was to risk being open to forces both visible and unseen. Amulets also held a social and symbolic role. To gift a charm was more than a gesture of affection. It was to offer someone a share of your own protection, to bind your fortune with theirs. A warrior might give a token to a comrade, a promise that they would face fate together. A lover might offer a pendant, carrying not only beauty but the hope of enduring connection. These objects were saturated with meaning because they embodied both the sacred powers they represented and the human bonds they carried. The making of charms was itself a ritual. Metalworkers who shaped hammers or animal figures often did so with deliberate care, treating their craft as more than labor. Each strike of the hammer, each carving of detail, was infused with intent. Even those who fashioned charms from wood, bone, or stone often spoke words over their work, as though summoning its spirit into being. Creation was not mechanical but sacred, a way of bringing together human skill and divine force. Archaeologists who uncover these objects often find them worn smooth by years of touch, suggesting that they were not idle decorations but lived companions. They traveled across seas, witnessed battles, survived winters, and lay in the soil with the dead. Their very survival is a testament to how much they mattered, for they were carried through every trial, kept when other possessions might be lost or discarded. To the Vikings, charms and amulets were not childish superstitions. They were anchors of meaning in a world of uncertainty, small fragments of stability against storms both natural and spiritual. In wearing them, They reminded themselves that they were not alone, that gods, spirits, and ancestors walked with them, that strength could be drawn not only from muscle and weapon but from faith and symbol. Life was a constant dialogue with forces unseen, and every charm was a word spoken in that endless conversation. Even today, when we look upon a small hammer pendant or a carved wolf tooth lying in a museum, we are seeing not just an ornament but a life carried within it. Each scratch, each worn edge, each faint trace of handling tells the story of someone who once believed with all their being that in this object rested power enough to guard them against fate. And in that belief, the charm became real, not only for them but for us, as witnesses to a culture that wove magic into every corner of its world. Among the many figures who shaped the lives of the Vikings, none held such a mixture of awe and fear as the seers and prophets. These were people who seemed to stand with one foot in the world of men and one foot in the world beyond. To encounter them was to brush against fate itself, to hear whispers that might change the course of a life, a voyage, or even a kingdom. The seers were not warriors with swords, nor farmers with plows, yet their influence reached into every hall, every ship, and every field. They carried no crown, but their voices could weigh as heavily as any ruler's command. In many stories, the image of the vulva, the female seer, appears with striking power. Draped in a long cloak, carrying a staff carved with symbols, she would enter a community as though stepping out of another realm. People treated her with deep reverence, offering her food, gifts, and shelter, for to honor her was to honor the powers she carried. She was believed to be able to see not only the threads of what had been, but also the fragile strands of what might be. Her words could give courage, or they could cast shadows over hearts that heard them. Even kings bowed before her visions, knowing that human pride was small against the flow of destiny. Seers were often asked to foretell the outcome of journeys. Before a fleet set sail across unknown waters, the leaders might summon a prophetess to speak of whether the winds would favor them or whether storms would rise. When warriors gathered for battle, they sought her words to know whether victory or death lay ahead. Farmers, too, listened, hoping to learn if the coming season would be kind or cruel. Her answers were never simple commands, but riddles wrapped in imagery, for the future was never shown in clear lines. Instead, she painted with symbols and shadows, leaving it to her listeners to unravel the meaning. The process of prophecy itself was a ritual, not an ordinary conversation. The vulva often sang in strange tones, weaving chants that echoed with ancient rhythm. Some said these songs were the language of the spirits, words that bridged the worlds. Her body might sway, her eyes close, and her voice rise as though she were no longer entirely herself, but a vessel filled by forces beyond. In that trance, she spoke with authority that silenced even the boldest. Those who listened believed they were hearing not the woman alone, but the gods, the Norns, or the restless dead speaking through her. Prophets did not always bring comfort. In fact, their words often carried a weight that unsettled even those who asked for them. To be told of doom was as important as to be told of success, for knowing allowed preparation. A leader warned of betrayal might watch his allies more closely. A family warned of sickness might gather herbs and prayers. Even when fate could not be changed, to be forewarned gave dignity, a chance to meet destiny with open eyes rather than blind stumbling. The Vikings believed that death could not always be avoided, but it could be faced with strength, and prophecy gave them that strength. The seers themselves lived apart from ordinary life. Many were wanderers, moving from settlement to settlement, welcomed yet also feared. People respected their power, but also kept their distance, for to be too close to one who spoke with the unseen was dangerous. They might carry blessings, but they might also draw misfortune. This ambivalence gave them an aura of mystery. They were needed, yet they were never fully embraced. Their role was both sacred and unsettling, reminding everyone that the world was larger and stranger than daily tasks might suggest. Men could also act as prophets, though in many accounts it was women who were seen as the primary vessels of foresight. Male seers sometimes drew their strength through runes, casting them in patterns and interpreting the shapes that formed. They might also read omens in the flight of birds, in the twisting of flames, or in the entrails of animals offered in sacrifice. Whatever their methods, all prophets shared the belief that signs were everywhere, waiting to be read by those trained to see. To them, the world was like a vast script written by the gods, and their task was to teach others how to glimpse the lines. Stories from the sagas show how deeply these figures shaped decisions. A warlord might abandon a campaign if warned of disaster. A family might choose to leave their homeland if told of famine. At times, prophecy drove entire migrations, setting people on paths that reshaped history. Even when people resisted the seer's words, those words lingered in their minds, gnawing at choices, turning doubts into reality. The power of prophecy lay not only in the visions themselves, but in the weight they carried in human hearts. The seers and prophets also tied people to myth. Their visions often invoked the gods or the Norns who wove the fates of men. To hear them speak was to be reminded that human lives were threads in a larger tapestry, one that stretched back to creation and forward to the doom of Ragnarok. They gave voice to the invisible structure of belief, turning myth into living guidance. In their chants and riddles, people could hear echoes of Yggdrasil, the great tree, and the hidden hands of destiny at work. In the end, the seers and prophets were not simply predictors of events. They were interpreters of meaning, giving shape to the uncertainties of existence. They stood as bridges between fear and understanding, between the seen and unseen, between the everyday and the eternal. Through them, the Vikings learned not only what might come, but how to live in a world where fate and freedom intertwined like roots of a great, shadowy tree. To ignore them was folly, and to heed them was sometimes terror, but in every case, they reminded their people that life was never lived alone, but always beneath the gaze of forces greater than themselves. When the Vikings prepared for war, it was never only a matter of sharpening swords and fitting shields. Battle to them was not just a clash of strength, but an event steeped in ritual, belief, and the presence of unseen powers. To march to war without honoring these forces would have been unthinkable, for they believed that steel alone could not carry them to victory. Courage had to be joined with blessing, and blood had to be paired with prayer. Before warriors stepped onto the battlefield, they stepped into a world of rites that gave meaning and order to the chaos they were about to enter. The gathering of warriors was itself a ritual. Men came from farms, villages, and distant halls, carrying weapons polished and banners raised. But before their leaders gave the signal to march, sacred acts were performed to prepare them. Sacrifices of animals were made, their blood caught in bowls and sprinkled over weapons and shields. This was not brutality for its own sake, but an offering to the gods of war and victory, a plea that their eyes might turn favorably on the coming struggle. The spilling of blood before battle was seen as a mirror of the blood that would soon be shed, a way of inviting fortune to stand with them rather than against them. Chants and invocations rose in the camps, voices joining in rhythm that carried both fear and fire. Priests or seers called on Odin, the god of wisdom and battle, to grant courage and clarity. Thor was asked to lend his strength, to break enemy lines as he broke giants. Freyr was invoked too, for she claimed half of the fallen warriors and was honored as a force of passion and protection. These prayers were not distant mutterings but cries full of urgency, shouted into the night sky as if the gods stood near enough to hear. In those moments, the boundary between men and gods blurred, and every warrior felt part of something greater than himself. Weapons were also drawn into the rites. Some blades were marked with runes carved into the steel or painted on with blood. These signs were believed to channel the essence of divine power, making the weapon not just a tool of war but a bearer of fate. Shields, too, were sometimes painted with sacred symbols, turning them into walls against both spear and spell. Even helmets and armor could carry inscriptions, reminders that the warrior was wrapped not only in iron but in faith. To hold such a weapon was to carry a piece of the gods' will into battle. The rituals were not only about the fight to come, but also about the bond among those who fought. Warriors drank together, swearing oaths that they would not falter, that they would hold the line no matter the storm. Some cut themselves lightly and let the blood mix, sealing loyalty in flesh. These acts forged a sense of brotherhood that could withstand the terror of war. They went to battle not as scattered men but as a single body, bound not only by command but by sacred promise. When the first clash began, ritual followed them onto the field. War cries were not merely shouts of rage, but calls infused with spiritual weight. The famous cry of "Odin owns you all" was a reminder to enemies that their lives and deaths were already in the gods' hands. Berserkers, the fearsome warriors who fought in trance-like fury, were themselves living rituals, embodying the spirit of bears or wolves through chants, drugs, or deep focus. They entered battle transformed, believing themselves possessed by animal strength, a terrifying presence meant to shake enemy hearts before swords even touched. If victory came, it too was wrapped in ritual. Returning warriors often gave thanks to the gods with further sacrifices, offering up part of the spoils to show gratitude and humility. Some captives might be given as offerings, their lives surrendered to Odin as a payment for triumph. The dead were honored with rites as well, their bodies burned or buried with weapons, ensuring they carried dignity into the afterlife. These rituals after battle were just as important as those before it, for they kept the balance between men and gods, between the living and the fallen. Victory feasts were themselves sacred in their own way. The halls filled with the smell of roasted meat, the sound of horns, and the telling of tales. Yet beneath the joy was always a thread of solemnity. Cups were raised not only to celebrate the living, but to honor the dead, whose courage had made the victory possible. Skalds recited verses that bound the memory of the battle into song, ensuring that it would not fade but become part of the shared history. In those verses, warriors lived again, their deeds preserved as long as tongues could speak. Even defeat carried ritual weight. If a battle was lost, survivors sought to cleanse themselves of shame through offerings or journeys. Leaders might seek the words of seers to understand what angered the gods, what sign had been missed. Loss was never seen as random. It was always the outcome of destiny, the will of powers too great to ignore. To move forward, the people had to realign themselves with that will, to restore harmony through ritual. In every act, from the sharpening of a sword to the raising of a cup after victory, the Vikings tied war to the sacred. To them, battle was not simply the collision of men, but the movement of forces beyond sight. Their rituals gave shape to fear, courage to hearts, and meaning to both triumph and loss. Without them, war would have been only chaos. With them, war became a stage where gods and men met, where death was not only an end but a passage, and where every drop of blood carried the echo of eternity. When a Viking went to war, or even simply lived his daily life on the farm, he was never far from the shadow of danger. Swords could cut, axes could crush, ships could sink, and illness could sweep through a household without warning. To meet this endless risk, the Norse people relied not only on skill or strength, but also on forces of the unseen world. Healing, curses, and protection formed a great triangle of magic that touched nearly every aspect of their existence. Each of these was born from the belief that fate might be shaped or swayed by words, symbols, and rituals, that no wound or sickness or enemy malice stood entirely beyond the reach of hidden power. Healing was often a blend of what we might now call practical medicine and sacred rite. Women skilled in herbs gathered plants from forest, meadow, and shore, each leaf or root chosen with both knowledge and reverence. Yarrow was used to staunch bleeding, juniper to fight infection, and angelica to strengthen the body against fever. Yet the giving of such remedies was never only about the physical. Words were spoken as the herbs were applied, chants whispered to awaken their strength. Some healers carved runes on pieces of bark or bone and placed them beside the sickbed, believing that the signs themselves carried the power to mend what was broken. Healing, then, was never just the application of plants, but the weaving of body and spirit into harmony once more. When wounds came from battle, healing required even greater effort. Warriors returned with cuts, broken bones, or burns from fire. To close such wounds, healers sometimes recited spells to drive out the sickness that was thought to live in the injury. They believed pain was not only flesh torn, but a force that could linger unless cast out. In some stories, charms were sung 3 times over a wound, each repetition binding the skin closer together, each word an invisible stitch. In this way, the work of healing hands was strengthened by the work of sacred speech, giving the wounded man a chance to rise again. But just as there were rites for healing, there were also words for harm. Curses occupied a dark corner of Viking magic, feared as much as they were desired. To curse an enemy was to call down ruin upon him, to twist his fortune and weaken his strength. Such curses might be spoken aloud, carved into wood, or even inscribed on a weapon, so that every strike carried not only steel but malice wrapped in power. The curse was a weapon of its own, invisible yet capable of breaking the spirit before the body was touched. Stories tell of enemies struck with sudden sickness, of ships cursed to sink, of families haunted by misfortune after a bitter rival had spoken against them. To curse was dangerous, for it was believed that to send out harm risked its return if the gods did not favor the act. Yet in a world where power and honor meant survival, curses were sometimes seen as the only answer against stronger foes. In these acts, one can see both the fear and the daring of a people who knew the balance between light and shadow was never stable. Protection stood as the shield against both harm and curse. The Vikings crafted amulets, often bearing the hammer of Thor, to wear around necks or keep in homes. These charms were more than decoration. They were anchors of safety, believed to guard against evil and misfortune. Runes were carved on doorposts, ships, and weapons as wards. The Allgai's rune, shaped like a reaching hand or antler, was often used for defense, a sign that invited protection from divine forces. Carrying such a mark was like wrapping oneself in unseen armor. Beyond symbols, entire rituals were devoted to protection. A household might be blessed before winter to guard against famine. A ship might be circled in smoke from burning herbs before it left harbor, a way of placing it under safe passage. Children were especially guarded with charms, for their lives were fragile, and parents feared the wandering spirits that might steal their breath. These protections gave people a sense of safety in a world where certainty was rare, where the sea could rise without warning and an illness could strike in the night. It is striking how healing, curses, and protection often blurred into one another. A healer could also be a curser, for the same words that closed a wound could be twisted to open one. A charm to protect could become a weapon if bent in intent. The Vikings did not see strict boundaries, but a flowing of power that could be guided toward good or ill depending on need. To them, words, signs, and rites were tools, and it was the hand and heart of the user that determined whether they saved or destroyed. The role of fate was never forgotten in these practices. No healing charm could promise life if the Norns had cut the thread short. No curse could strike a man who walked firmly within the favor of the gods. No amulet could shield forever against death. Yet these rituals gave the Vikings a way to act against the helplessness of existence. They were ways of saying, I will not surrender to chance. I will not bow without fight. Even if fate could not be avoided, it could be met with dignity, with effort, with belief that men were not left entirely powerless. In these acts of healing, cursing, and protecting, we see a culture that refused to separate the spiritual from the practical. Medicine was prayer, harm was word, safety was symbol. Every wound carried both flesh and spirit, every curse struck both body and soul, every protection guarded both seen and unseen. It was this interweaving that gave the Vikings their unique strength, a way of living in a harsh world with courage, defiance, and a constant call to the powers that walked beside them, unseen but always present. In every Viking settlement, no matter how small or remote, whispers carried the names of those who were said to see farther than ordinary eyes. These were the seers and prophets of the north, the men and women who could step into the thin places between worlds, who could listen where others only heard silence, who could speak of futures that had not yet arrived. They were not kings, yet kings sought them out. They were not warriors, yet warriors feared their words. They were not gods, yet they claimed to know what the gods intended. Their role was strange and vital, at once admired and feared, for to walk with prophecy was to hold a dangerous gift. Most often it was women who took on this burden, known as vulvas, staff-bearers, those who carried the rod that marked them as chosen to speak with the hidden. These women traveled from farm to farm, from hall to hall, welcomed not only with gifts but with caution, for their arrival meant truths might be revealed that could not easily be ignored. They dressed in long robes, often adorned with beads, stones, and symbols of power. Their staffs were not mere walking sticks but sacred tools, connecting them to forces beyond the reach of others. With chants and rituals, with the drinking of sacred mead, with the weaving of spells, they entered a state where the veil of the future could be lifted. The prophecies given were rarely simple. A vulva would not declare plainly, "You will win this battle," or "You will lose your child." Instead, she spoke in riddles, in verses that circled truth without capturing it directly. Such speech reflected the very nature of fate, which was never straight but twisted like the roots of Yggdrasil. Listeners leaned in, hungry and anxious, each trying to interpret what the signs meant for them. A king might hear that victory was his, while his enemies heard the same words and believed they were destined to triumph. The ambiguity was not weakness but power, for it allowed the seer's words to echo long after she left, shaping choices and guiding steps in ways more profound than a blunt prediction ever could. Prophecy was not only about war or kingship, but also about the everyday lives of common folk. A farmer might ask whether his harvest would be strong or if wolves would take his livestock. A woman might wish to know if her child would grow into a strong man or fall in youth. Sailors before a voyage asked whether the sea would carry them safely or drag them beneath. For all these questions, the seer's answer mattered, even if it did not promise certainty. To hear the words of a prophet was to feel a thread of connection to the vast, mysterious web of fate, to believe that one's own small life mattered within it. The seers themselves lived on the edges of society. They were honored with gifts, food, and fine seats at the feast, yet they were not truly part of the community. People feared to offend them, for a curse from one who saw the future could weigh heavily on a household. At the same time, they were not always trusted, for prophecy could be dangerous. A chieftain might rise or fall because of their words. A marriage might be broken, a journey abandoned, a feud sparked. This gave the seers power, but it also left them vulnerable. To bear the sight of fate was a heavy task, and not all welcomed it gladly. There were also men who practiced prophecy, though they often faced suspicion. In a culture that prized masculine strength and courage, to take on the role of a prophet was to step into a space thought more fitting for women, and this sometimes brought shame. Yet those men who mastered the art, often through seer, the magical practice that Odin himself was said to use, could wield immense influence. They endured whispers and doubt, but when their visions proved true, no one dared deny their power. In them, people saw the unsettling truth that prophecy belonged to no single gender, but to those chosen by forces greater than human order. What made these seers so important was not just their visions, but the way they tied the people to the divine. To consult a prophet was to reach beyond the human world and touch the realm of gods, giants, and spirits. It was a reminder that life was not only what could be seen or touched, but also what was written in threads too fine for most to notice. Their presence gave shape to the great questions that haunted every soul. What lies ahead? Am I safe? Will I find glory, or will I fall into ruin? In a world filled with risk and uncertainty, prophecy was a form of guidance, even when its meaning was unclear. The great sagas are filled with moments where a prophet's voice changed everything. A Volva might warn a king of betrayal, setting him to guard himself more closely. A warrior might hear of his doomed fate and choose to meet it with courage, knowing the end was written. A mother might hear that her son would bring both greatness and sorrow, and her life would forever be shaped by those words. These stories show how deeply prophecy ran in Viking culture, not as a distant or rare occurrence, but as a living force woven into the choices of rulers and peasants alike. And yet, prophecy was never absolute. The Vikings believed that some parts of fate were fixed, but others could be bent or delayed. To hear a warning was not always to hear a sentence. Sometimes the words of a seer were a chance to act differently, to avoid a snare that had been set. This made prophecy a source of both fear and hope, a double-edged gift that could guide as much as it could terrify. In this way, the seers did not simply reveal the future. They shaped it, for their visions influenced the decisions of those who listened. Seers and prophets were the voices of destiny in a land where men fought, sailed, and struggled against a harsh world. They gave meaning to events, offered glimpses of the hidden, and bound the people more closely to their gods and to the vast mystery of existence. In their hands, the future was never just a blank horizon, but a path already marked with signs, waiting for those brave enough to walk it. The North was a place of warriors and kings, but without the seers, it would have been a land without direction, a place where men fought blindly in the dark. With them, even in uncertainty, there was a sense of order, of connection, of purpose. When we think of magic among the Vikings, it is easy to imagine only the great seers, the priests of Odin, or the kings who sought out prophecy before battles. Yet the truth is that magic was not reserved for the powerful or the rare. It ran like a quiet current through the daily lives of common folk, present in every village, every farmstead, and every household. It was not always dramatic or filled with visions of the gods, but it was steady and close, woven into the ordinary rhythm of life. For the people of the North, magic was as natural as the wind or the sea, and it lived in the simplest of actions. A woman might whisper charms over her loom as she wove, believing that the right words spoken at the right moment could keep sickness away or ensure that the cloth she created carried blessings for those who wore it. A farmer might carve runes into the handle of his plough, not only to strengthen the wood, but to call upon the favor of the earth spirits for a rich harvest. Sailors scratched protective symbols onto the timbers of their ships, trusting that these marks, though silent and still, had the power to hold back storms and shield them from the jaws of the sea serpent that lurked in the deep. To the outside eye, these actions may have looked small, even superstitious, but to those who lived them, they were part of a relationship with forces larger than themselves. Magic was most often called upon in times of need. When a child fell ill, a mother might boil herbs and chant words passed down from her grandmother, believing that both the plants and the spell worked together to drive out the sickness. When winter threatened to be long and cruel, families placed offerings at the hearth to ensure warmth and survival. When wolves circled too close to the farm, men might burn certain woods, creating smoke that was thought to repel both beasts and evil spirits. These practices were not separate from daily chores. They were woven into them. To cook, to clean, to care for animals, to tend the fields. These tasks could all be accompanied by acts of small magic. For many, charms and amulets were constant companions. Children wore pieces of iron or carved bone on cords around their necks to keep away harmful beings. Men carried Thor's hammer pendants, not just as a mark of faith, but as protection from harm. Women tied knots in string to bind good fortune to themselves, or to trap bad luck before it could reach their families. Even the act of naming carried magic, for names were believed to shape destiny. To give a child a strong name was to set them on a path of strength. To carry the name of an ancestor was to inherit some of their power. Magic also lived in stories and songs. Around the fire in the evening, people told tales not only for entertainment, but as a way of passing on hidden wisdom. A story of Odin's travels or Thor's battles was not just myth, but a reminder of the presence of the gods in the world, a lesson about courage, cunning, or patience. Songs carried rhythm and power, and when sung with intent, they were thought to move more than hearts. A lullaby could soothe more than a child. It could keep restless spirits at bay. A work song sung in the fields did more than set a rhythm for labor. It was a way to call on unseen forces to bless the work. Everyday magic was also tied to the natural world. Stones with unusual shapes were kept as treasures, believed to carry strength or healing. Streams, groves, and certain trees were treated with respect, as if they were alive with spirit. To walk into the forest without offering a word or leaving a gift was to risk angering the beings who dwelled there. In this way, the land itself was alive with magic, and people lived in constant awareness of it. Even weather was read as a message, with winds, rains, and strange lights in the sky understood not just as natural events, but as signs that demanded attention. Importantly, this everyday magic was not thought of as separate from religion. For the common folk, the gods were not distant figures hidden in the heavens. They were present in the soil, the sea, the fire, the tools of work, and the rituals of the home. To practice a charm was to call on the gods' favor. To sing a protective song was to honor them. To carve a rune was to touch the mysteries that Odin himself had revealed. There was no strict line between the sacred and the ordinary. The sacred lived inside the ordinary, waiting to be awakened by human hands and voices. It was this closeness of magic that gave the Vikings a sense of resilience. Life in the north was harsh, and survival often hung on fragile threads. Crops failed, storms destroyed ships, feuds erupted, sickness spread. Against such challenges, people did not feel powerless, for they believed they had tools to meet the unknown. Even the smallest act, a whispered charm, a carved symbol, a handful of herbs, was a way to push back against chaos, to assert some measure of control in a world that could never be fully tamed. And yet, everyday magic was not always gentle. Just as people used charms to bless, others whispered curses to harm. Envy, anger, and rivalry sometimes led to secret acts meant to bring misfortune to another. A failed harvest, a sudden illness, an accident could all be blamed on hidden malice. This made magic both comfort and threat, a force that united communities but also kept them wary. No one could ever be entirely sure where goodwill ended and ill will began. In this way, magic mirrored life itself, a mixture of light and shadow, hope and fear. In the end, the everyday magic of the common folk was not about spectacle, but about survival, belonging, and meaning. It gave shape to uncertainty, strength to the weak, and connection to forces beyond sight. It was a way of saying that life was more than what could be touched or measured, that there were always unseen currents flowing through the world. For the Viking farmer, sailor, or mother, this quiet magic was as essential as food or fire. It reminded them that they were never alone, that every breath they took was part of a larger song sung by gods, spirits, and ancestors. And so, in homes of turf and timber, in fields of grain and snow, in longships cutting across the dark seas, the common folk of the north carried magic with them always, woven into their hands, their words, and their lives. Though centuries have passed since the last longships cut across the seas, the presence of Viking magic and myth has not vanished. It lingers, reshaped by time, memory, and imagination, carried into the modern world in ways both subtle and striking. We no longer live in halls warmed by central fires, nor do we scratch protective runes onto plough handles before tilling the fields, but the echoes of those acts remain with us. The magic of the Vikings has become part of the larger story of humanity's need to seek meaning, protection, and wonder in forces beyond the visible. Much of this legacy is found in language. Many words we still use today have roots in Old Norse, and within them are fragments of the magical worldview that once guided daily life. To speak of luck, fate, or doom is to touch concepts that were deeply woven into the Viking sense of existence, ideas shaped by their myths and their belief in unseen powers. Even in everyday expressions, we carry remnants of a world where spoken words were never casual, but were acts of creation, blessings, or curses. In this way, the power of language as magic has survived, though we may not always notice it. Runes too have endured, though their role has shifted. Once carved as charms or inscriptions to bind fate, they are now studied, admired, and sometimes revived as symbols of heritage, identity, or personal power. Modern seekers turn to runes for divination, much as Viking seers once did, drawing meaning from the shapes that Odin himself was said to have revealed. They appear in jewelry, tattoos, art, and even popular culture, carrying a mystique that bridges ancient belief with modern imagination. For many, the runes are not just letters of a lost script, but gateways to an older way of seeing the world, a reminder that writing itself was once considered magical. The myths of the Norse gods have also proven enduring, surviving not only in manuscripts preserved by medieval scribes, but in the living memory of culture. Odin, Thor, Loki, Freyr, and countless others are names that still resonate today, not confined to dusty stories but alive in books, films, games, and even in the names of days on our calendars. Thursday still belongs to Thor, and Wednesday to Odin. Each week we unknowingly honor gods that once stood at the heart of Viking religion. This continuity shows how myth, like magic, is never entirely lost. It adapts, reshapes, and finds new ways to speak to new generations. The legacy of Viking magic also rests in our fascination with the natural world. Many today feel a deep pull toward the forests, seas, and skies, a sense that there is more to nature than what science can measure. This feeling is not unlike the Viking view of a world alive with spirits, where groves were sacred, stones carried power, and rivers could speak. The idea that land holds memory, that places can be holy, that nature deserves reverence. These are echoes of an ancient perspective that still whispers to us, especially in times when we seek reconnection with the earth. In the modern imagination, the image of the Viking is often tied to strength, courage, and fearlessness in the face of chaos. Yet alongside that warrior spirit lies their magical worldview, which shaped how they faced uncertainty. People today continue to look to Viking myths and magic not only for stories of battle, but for guidance in confronting their own challenges. Runes are drawn for insight, sagas are read for wisdom, rituals are recreated to find grounding in an age that often feels rootless. In this way, Viking magic provides not just nostalgia but tools for meaning in the present. The Viking afterlife, too, has left a mark on how we think about death and destiny. Valhalla, the Hall of the Fallen, has become a symbol of bravery, of meeting fate without fear. Even for those who do not believe in the old gods, the image of warriors feasting in Odin's hall continues to inspire songs, art, and remembrance. It reflects a human desire to see death not as an end, but as a passage to a realm of honor and continuity. Through this, the old myths still offer comfort and courage. One of the most powerful aspects of the Viking magical legacy is its adaptability. In their own time, magic was not separate from life, but part of it, shifting with need and circumstance. That same adaptability allows it to persist now, centuries later. Whether as a subject of scholarly study, a source of spiritual practice, or a wellspring of creative inspiration, it finds new forms without losing its core. It survives because it speaks to something timeless, the human need to believe in more than what the eye can see. At the same time, the legacy of Viking magic reminds us of the dangers of forgetting balance. Just as magic in their time could bless or curse, protect or harm, its echoes today can inspire or mislead. Myths can be used to unite or divide. Symbols can be honored or misused. The responsibility lies in how we carry them forward, in remembering that magic was always about relationship, with gods, with spirits, with the land, with one another. It was never only about power, but about connection. Perhaps that is the deepest legacy of Viking magic, the reminder that human beings are always reaching beyond themselves, always searching for ways to connect with the unseen and the eternal. Whether through runes carved on stone, chants whispered in the night, or stories told around a fire, the Vikings showed that life was richer when bound to mystery. We may live in an age of electricity and machines, yet the same desire stirs within us. We still listen for whispers in the wind, still search for signs in the patterns of chants, still long for stories that make us feel part of something greater. The Vikings are gone, their ships rotted, their halls silent. But their magic has not disappeared. It moves quietly through our words, our symbols, our stories, and our sense of wonder. It asks us to see the world not as empty but as alive, not as cold but as filled with meaning. It invites us, as it once invited them, to walk through life knowing that every act, every word, every symbol can carry power. And in that invitation, their magic lives on, not as a relic of the past, but as a living thread that ties us to them, to the earth, and to the mystery that will always lie just beyond the edge of sight.